Okay, so in this video, we are going to briefly look at prenatal development. Now, a typical 9-month pregnancy is commonly divided into 3 trimesters, each one lasting 3 months each approximately. However, when we look at prenatal development, we can also identify these 3 major prenatal stages or periods. They are not the same as the 3 trimesters. Okay, if you look at the weeks here, these first 2 stages occur during the first trimester, and then this last stage begins in the first trimester and continues until the end. So they are not the same as the 3 trimesters. Remember that. Now, the germinal stage is the stage that begins the moment conception occurs. Okay, so the moment the sperm fertilizes an egg, it forms a zygote, and this stage begins. A zygote is a one-cell structure. So when that sperm and egg join, they create one cell. And then throughout this germinal stage, that one cell begins to divide, and this is called mitosis, okay, the process of cell division. Once that zygote has fully implanted itself into the wall of the uterus, we now enter the embryonic stage. So in those first 2 weeks, the cell is dividing, it's becoming more specialized, forming organs and body parts, and then once it's implanted itself into the wall of the uterus, we're now in the embryonic stage. So at this point, it is now a multicellular organism. It's more than one cell, so it's no longer called a zygote, it is now called an embryo. It's during this stage that all of the major organs begin to take shape. So usually around 3 weeks in, that's where you start to see the nervous system develop. So the brain, the spinal cord, the blood vessels start to develop during this stage. And then about 4 weeks in is when the heart starts to beat. It is also during this stage that the placenta forms. So that is the structure that's connected to the uterus that provides nourishment and oxygen from the mother to the embryo via the umbilical cord. Finally, around week 9, it enters the fetal stage. At this point, it is now called a fetus. Not a zygote, not an embryo, it is now called a fetus. And this continues all the way until the end of pregnancy. So usually by around week 12, so a few weeks into the fetal stage, and the end of the first trimester, all of the major organ systems are formed. It is during this stage that then the brain continues to develop, and then the body adds size, it adds weight, until the fetus reaches full-term development. So this is what you can see happening here. I won't go through this, but it's showing you some of the things that are developing each week during the fetal stage. Now, there are various genetic and environmental factors that can affect development during each of these prenatal stages in different ways. So in addition to the mother obviously eating well and looking after her health during pregnancy, it is extremely important to be receiving prenatal care, which is medical care during pregnancy, in order to monitor the health of the mother and the fetus, because as we're about to discuss, there are all of these things that can affect development, and the idea is to try to catch that as soon as possible. So these things that I just mentioned are called teratogens. So these include any environmental agents that cause damage to the developing embryo or fetus. Now please note that it says embryo or fetus. It does not say zygote, because remember, it is not until we have an embryo until that zygote has divided that in the second stage the placenta forms. And remember, it is the placenta that is carrying all of this nutrition to the baby. So at that point, once that placenta is developed, anything that is being put into the mother's body, anything that the mother catches in terms of viruses, at that point can be transferred to the baby, because everything is flowing through the placenta. So before that, the risks are fairly low for the first couple of weeks, because the placenta hasn't formed yet. So when we're talking about teratogens, they can be biological, they can be chemical, they can be physical, it can be anything that potentially damages the developing embryo or fetus. So we're going to briefly go through these. The big one is alcohol, because this can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome. And this is what you can see here. So, fetal alcohol syndrome is a collection of birth defects that's associated with heavy consumption of alcohol during pregnancy. One of the big things that you see are these abnormal facial features, and they typically have a smaller head size. But there are also a lot of cognitive impairments. So you tend to see poor judgment, poor impulse control, higher rates of ADHD, learning problems, lower IQ. Actually, in fact, research has found that alcohol is the leading preventable cause of intellectual disability in children in the United States. So remember, an intellectual disability is when a person has an IQ below 70. Okay? So of all of the things that can cause a person to have an intellectual disability that could be prevented, drinking alcohol during pregnancy is the biggest one. Now, of course, initially when the baby is born, you wouldn't realize that. It would be something that you notice later as they're progressing and they're going to school, and you start to notice that they're falling behind. Then you would most likely start to see that. Nicotine. So smoking actually quite often leads to miscarriages. When it doesn't, it usually will result in a premature birth, and with that comes very low birth weight. You see more stillbirths with people that drink. That smoke. You also see higher rates of sudden infant death syndrome. So this is when there is a sudden and unexplained death that usually occurs while the baby is sleeping. Okay, so this is after they're born. And I say sudden and unexplained, but it has been linked to smoking. It obviously can lead to lung problems such as asthma, and just like alcohol, you start to see developmental problems. So things like reduced attention span, learning problems, behavioral problems such as ADHD. In fact, most of these are linked to some form of developmental delay, which again, you might not see until later on when the child's a bit older. Drugs, I'm not going to go through all of the different types of drugs and the effects that they can have, but I do want to highlight that this doesn't just include illegal drugs. This also includes prescription drugs. Again, that's why it's so important to be seeing a doctor during pregnancy and making sure that the prescription drugs you're taking aren't putting the baby at risk. Infections or viruses. So for example, rubella, if a mother contracts that during pregnancy, that can lead to things like heart disease, deafness, and again, intellectual disability. So it's very important as a woman to get vaccinated against rubella before pregnancy. It's important to get vaccinated against any viruses that could be transferred or impact the baby in some way. STDs can actually be transmitted from the mother to the child during pregnancy. Obviously now the big question is, what about COVID-19? What impact is that going to have? And the reality is, we can't be sure just yet. Like as we've discussed with many of these, one of the big things that it does is create an intellectual disability or lead to an intellectual disability. And if that were to happen, or if there were behavioral problems or learning problems, those are things we won't see until those children are a few years older. So we might not see the cognitive impact of this for a while. So even if these babies are being born and they seem fine, maybe they don't have any physical problems, doesn't necessarily mean that catching COVID-19 during pregnancy hasn't had an effect. Most likely, as with most infections and viruses, it will. Although I will note they are usually at their most dangerous during the first trimester. After that, the risk tends to go down. Radiation. So women, you may have noticed that every time you go for some form of an x-ray, if you've ever been for one, they will ask you, is there any chance whatsoever that you might be pregnant? And that is because radiation is very dangerous if you are. I won't get into all of the potential consequences of that, but I will mention a couple. It can lead to a small skull, which is obviously going to be problematic, and blindness is common from that as well. Maternal diseases, again, there's a lot, so I can't go through them all. I'll just mention one, diabetes. That can lead to abnormal tissue formation. It can also lead to various birth defects, like we've already discussed. So again, I know I haven't gone through these in a huge amount of detail. The main point is to be aware that these exist and that they can be problematic.